All right, you all made it back after that crazy last Wednesday. So I didn't realize the reach that the Rejebian review series has, but tonight we went all the way to Virginia. So we're pretty excited about that. But before we do, I told you last week I had something funny, but I couldn't do it last week. So I'm gonna do it tonight. For the last 69 plus years, I've sort of happily lived in the shadow of my cousin, Eben, who is up here somewhere tonight. And he's smarter than me, he's funnier than me. He, of course, is better looking than me. That's me on the right. But he celebrated a pretty momentous birthday last week, and the only thing I have over him is I'm younger. Now, it's only by a month, but I'm younger. So, Eben, sorry. I know I did it on Facebook, but I had to do it here. So I'm going to turn the microphone over to Arang Sestuli from the church to welcome us and pray, and then she's going to give it to Richard Stanford to introduce our speaker, John Ragosta.
Good evening. I'm Arang Sestuli. I'm on the spiritual formation team, and I am your spiritual formation coordinator for volunteers and for the retired adults community here at HPUMC. With the Rejebian committee, I organized this program along with other events, day classes and day trips designed for people, just for people 65 and older. And as part of the spiritual formation ministry, we take care of people from the moment they walk in the doors so that they can get actively engaged with the life of this church. Whether it is worship, classes, Sunday morning classes, young adult, older adults, disability, as well as spiritual attention, and small groups. I understand that this is a huge church, and we do our best to make it feel small to help people become deeply devoted followers of Jesus Christ. So that's what I do here. Will you now please join me in prayer? Gracious God, thank you for this time and space to gather in anticipation of learning and reflection. As we explore the people and moments in history that continue to shape our lives, we acknowledge that you are not bound by time. You see what was, what is, and what is to come. Yet in the present moment, stir our hearts and minds to recognize what we say, think, and do for the good of your kingdom. We thank you especially for John Ragosta and the gifts that you have given him to research, write, and speak with insight and passion. We are grateful for his work on Patrick Henry, another voice you use to influence hearts and history. May the examples we hear today inspire, challenge, and move us to thoughtful action. Bless this time together, and may it bear good fruit. In Jesus Christ's name I pray, amen. Next, Richard Stanford will introduce our speaker for the evening.
Well, John Ragosta is a lawyer, historian, writer, and beekeeper. You can ask him afterwards how his hives are doing, but we'll see. But he started off with Dewey and Ballantyne doing trade litigation, WTO stuff, NAFTA stuff, as a partner in that firm. And then the history bug caught him, and he's a history professor and a writer. He actually now is a fellow of Virginia Humanities. He's previously been a fellow at the Miller operation out of Colonial Williamsburg. he, up until a while ago when he left that position, was historian and the interim director of the Jefferson Center at Monticello. And so he knows a little bit about Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry and all the people he's going to be talking about. He's written any number of books about Patrick Henry, Jefferson, the University of Virginia. He's taught at Oberlin and Hamilton and Randolph and UVA. In fact, he's taught law at the University of Virginia and at George Washington University. So he kind of knows what he's talking about and has had quite an interesting career. And he's going to lift up something with his book, For the People, for the Country, a part of American history that was very important that I bet very few of us know about. Really, I mean, it's something most people don't know about. And so books, paperback versions of the book are up there being sold by Interrobang. And if you didn't know, Interrobang is the largest independent bookstore in Dallas. And so we love to patronize Interrobang, and they do a wonderful job. Now, I think after you hear this, you're going to want to buy a book. But even if you are on the edge of it, go ahead and buy a book, because John Ragosta started off in Charlottesville, Virginia this morning, flew to Atlanta, laid over, flew to Dallas, got about a couple hours over at the Beeman, and here he is. And he's going to do the same thing tomorrow in reverse order. And basically, that's just an illustration to us that authors need to be of great intellect. They need to do great research. They need to be great writers, and they need to have an awful lot of energy. I mean, writing it's one thing, but taking it around the United States, which he has done for quite a while now, is a whole nother matter. So please welcome John Ragosta.
Thank you, Richard. Well, thank you all for coming. I want to tell you a story tonight about Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson and the hyper-partisanship of the 1790s that almost destroyed the new nation. Of course, I want to begin by thanking Richard. I want to thank David and the Rejebians. What a wonderful legacy to have an opportunity to bring people together to learn and to talk. This is just a wonderful series that you put on here at Highland Park, so I'm glad to be here. But let me start this story. There we go. Where the story began for me, I came across a letter that surprised me. The letter was written on January 15th, 1799. George Washington is living in retirement at Mount Vernon under his own vine and fig tree, to use one of his favorite biblical allusions. On this particular January day, it was mild and sunny outside. It was becoming very stormy inside Mount Vernon. We can almost sense the general pacing the wide pine boards, his anger rising. And finally, the man we know of as the sword of the American Revolution sits down at his desk, picks up a sheaf of paper and a quill pen to write a long letter to the man we know of as the trumpet of the American Revolution, Patrick Henry. Now, they had not communicated for many years, but Washington writes Henry, there is a crisis when everything dear and valuable to us is assailed. Washington goes on to complain, the endeavors of a certain party among us to disquiet the public mind with unfounded alarms, to arraign every act of the administration, to set the people at variance with their government, and to embarrass all its measures. Washington rails at some people who are putting their own personal political ambition above country and threatening the Union itself. Washington talks about the possibility of a civil war. A crisis exists which must eventually dissolve the Union or produce coercion. And by coercion, George Washington meant the U.S. Army marching on its own citizens. Washington begs Patrick Henry to come out of retirement to help address this growing crisis. Now, Henry was also in retirement. Henry had been living in retirement since 1791. Henry, of course, had been the leading anti-federalist in battles over ratification of the Constitution. He had opposed the Constitution because he believed the new government would be too powerful, too distant from the people. But he had been offered various jobs. He had been offered to be Supreme Court Justice. He had been offered to be Senator. He had been offered Secretary of State, Ambassador to France, Ambassador to Spain. He continually said, no, I'm in retirement. I'm in at Red Hill. He had told Washington many years earlier that he would only come out of retirement if necessary for the safety of my country. If the nation was at risk, if the nation faced the horrors of anarchy, the threat of disunion, Patrick Henry said he would come out of retirement. He receives George Washington's letter, and he writes back, I accord with every sentiment you expressed to me. Patrick Henry finally agrees to come out of retirement to defend the U.S. Constitution that he had opposed because he thought the nation was at risk. Well, who was it? Who was it that was threatening the Union? Who was it that was putting their personal political ambition above country and threatening civil war? It's none other than Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and the radical states' rights agenda of the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. Well, Patrick Henry does come out of retirement. He wins his election. Patrick Henry always wins his election. But he dies before he can take office. Had Patrick Henry lived to take office, Thomas Jefferson almost certainly would not have been elected president in 1800. Well, this is a fascinating story. And I had never heard anything about it. I had already finished my PhD in early American history when I read this letter, and I knew nothing about it. And I was immediately excited by the possibility. Here is a crisis with the sword of the American Revolution, the trumpet of the American Revolution, against the pen of the American Revolution and the father of the Constitution. And so I wanted to know some things. I wanted to know first, why was Patrick Henry, the intellectual godfather of the states' rights movement, coming out of retirement to oppose states' rights? And then I wanted to know about Jefferson. If it's true that he would not have been elected president, does this story tell us something about Jefferson that maybe we should know, or about James Madison? And then I had this third question. Why is this story not a bigger part of history? Is this historical forgetfulness? Or is maybe something more at work in this regard? So let's start with that first question. Why is Patrick Henry, the intellectual godfather of the states' rights movement, opposed to the states' rights? Well, to understand that, I think we have to get to 1798 and the Alien and Sedition Act. We can take a half a step back. George Washington is inaugurated as the first president in 1789, and the new United States is almost immediately launched into foreign policy crises because the French Revolution breaks out in July of 1789, and England and France are going to be at war almost constantly until the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. And both England and France want support from the United States. They want supplies. They want military supplies. They want food, maybe soldiers. And Washington realizes very early on, we can't get involved. The country's too new. The country's too weak. If we get pulled into every European war, it'll destroy the country. So in 1793, Washington issues the Neutrality Proclamation. It says we're going to be neutral. We're staying out of these European wars. In 1795, we enter into the Jay Treaty with Britain, with Great Britain. It's not a very good treaty. Nobody likes the Jay Treaty, but it keeps the peace. By 1798, the danger was revolutionary France and a rising Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, we had tried to reach peace with France as well. We had sent negotiators to France trying to maintain that peace, but the French ambassador, the French foreign minister, refused to even meet with the US ambassadors until they paid him a bribe. The so-called XYZ affair. Well, this is an insult. We're a new nation. The idea that we have to pay a bribe just to meet with the foreign minister, this is what leads to the slogan in the United States, millions for defense, but not one penny for tribute. And because of the XYZ affair, we're on the cusp of war with France. Now, it's called a quasi-war, but people are being shot. People are being killed. In the quasi-war with France, over 330 American ships were seized. Congress suspends trade with France. Riots are breaking out in Philadelphia, the US Capitol. Fights between the different political parties wanting to support France, wanting to support England. Those riots are so serious that the president, John Adams, has guns brought to the president's house for fear that the president's house was going to be attacked by the rioters. It's a crisis, a foreign policy crisis. So the Federalists, the party of George Washington and John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, they do three things. First, they increase the defense budget, which makes sense. We may have a war with France. Second thing they do is they adopt a series of alien acts, acts that have basically been dormant for 200 years and have become popular again. The third thing they do, and the most portentous, is they adopt the Sedition Act. The Sedition Act literally makes it illegal to criticize the President of the United States or the US Congress. You can go to jail for criticizing the President of the Congress. By the way, no, that's not what I'm going to say. I'm going to point out that the law doesn't say anything about the vice president. You can say whatever you want about the vice president. The vice president is Thomas Jefferson. This was back when the president and the vice president could be from different parties. Imagine Kamala Harris being the vice president to Donald Trump. Okay, you can say whatever you want about Thomas Jefferson, but you can go to jail for criticizing John Adams or criticizing the Congress. Now, for many years, historians told us that there were 14 indictments, 10 convictions. One historian refers to this as a paltry series of investigations. More recent evidence has shown this grossly underestimates what was happening. There were over 40 indictments, over 120 people were prosecuted, and they were specifically targeting opposition newspapers. They were throwing newspaper editors in jail for criticizing the government. And the juries were being packed. Almost everyone indicted, in fact, was convicted. Thomas Jefferson realized that this was a crisis. You can't have a functioning democracy, you can't have a functioning republic without a functioning free press. Thomas Jefferson wrote to James Madison and referred to this as a reign of witches. He tells Madison that the Democratic newspapers, if they fail, republicanism will be entirely browbeaten. He writes to another supporter, that to preserve freedom of the press, every spirit should be ready to devote itself to martyrdom. To martyrdom. It was a crisis. It was a real crisis. So what do you do? What do you do if you're Thomas Jefferson and James Madison facing this situation? How do you oppose government policy that you think is wrong, that you disagree with? Well, the first thing you do is obviously you win the next election, right? You throw the bums out, you change the laws. That's the way the system is supposed to work. But there's a problem with that. First of all, because of that XYZ affair, because of the quasi-war with France, John Adams, for the first and only time in his very long political career, was personally popular. He had taken to wearing a sword to public events because he was commander-in-chief. And Madison had warned about this before. Madison had warned that if you have a foreign policy crisis, it might be used politically. And then beyond that, there was the problem of the Sedition Act. Because how can you run a political campaign if you can go to jail for criticizing the president of Congress? So Jefferson and Madison are very concerned that the election may not work, may not solve the problem. So what do? What other options do you have? Well, the option, if they had consulted with their attorneys, they'd say, it's easy. You sue the buggers, right? It's unconstitutional. You have the law thrown out. It's a violation of the First Amendment. It's a violation of freedom of speech and freedom of press. And I realize this is 5 years before Marbury versus Madison, but they well knew that the court had the authority to throw out unconstitutional laws. Jefferson had said it, Madison had said it, Patrick Henry had said it, John Marshall had said it. That wasn't the problem. The problem was the law of freedom of press was still developing. In England, and we're still relying on a lot of English law at this time, in England, freedom of the press simply meant no prior restraint. But once you published something, you were subject to sedition. And what made things worse is 5 of the 6 sitting Supreme Court justices had heard cases under the Sedition Act and never said anything about its constitutionality. And if you bring a case and you lose, the Supreme Court declares the Alien and Sedition Acts are constitutional, then you're worse off. So what do you do? What do you do if you're Jefferson and Madison? Well, in desperation, they turned to a third option. They turned to the states. They wanted to use the states to help fight the federal government. Now, this had been tried before. In fact, in 1791, it was Patrick Henry who led the effort in Virginia to oppose Alexander Hamilton's financial program, believing it was unconstitutional. And Henry led the effort to have the Virginia General Assembly protest to the U.S. Congress and ask the Congress to change the law. But Jefferson is thinking about something far more than a mere protest. And he drafts the Kentucky resolutions. The Kentucky resolutions resurrect the idea that the United States is a mere compact of independent sovereign states. And Thomas Jefferson says an individual state may nullify, that's his term, may nullify a federal law that it believes to be unconstitutional. And if the United States is a mere compact of independent states, then there is the possibility of succession. And by 1799, Thomas Jefferson is openly talking about succession. Determined were we to be disappointed in this repeal of the Alien and Sedition Acts, to sever ourselves from that union we so much value. John Nicholas, a former member of the Virginia General Assembly, wrote that Virginia was making preparations of a military kind. One Virginia militia officer is quoted in the newspaper as saying, "If France invades, I will take my troops to the French banner rather than to the stars and stripes carried by a political opponent." Open treason. Newspapers are reporting the possibility of civil war. There's a report that comes out of Virginia. It's reprinted in over 40 newspapers around the country. It talks about civil war, the suspicion that a coalition for seceding from the Union exists. This is the second crisis, great crisis of American history that people didn't know much about. But this is what George Washington was writing to Patrick Henry about. George Washington was afraid of a situation where state against state with different versions of federal laws, state against the federal government, and the risk of civil war. And it's particularly poignant that he asked Patrick Henry, no one else, he asked Patrick Henry to come out of retirement to save the nation. As I had mentioned, Patrick Henry had been the great defender of the anti-federalist. He had been the great anti-federalist in battles over ratification of the Constitution. He said, we can't have this Constitution. The Constitution will create a government too powerful, too distant. He comes out of retirement and he goes to Charlotte Courthouse on March 4th, 1799, to make what people seem to understand will be his last political speech. People gather from all over the counties. The students from Hampton, Sydney abandon their classes, many of them walking 20 miles to Charlotte Courthouse to hear what Patrick Henry has to say. Henry rose that morning. It was said he appeared ill, he appeared weak, stooped a little from age and seemed feeble. It was said he had a Scottish cast to his face. His face was gray. His voice was broken and tremulous. But as Henry began to speak, a wonderful transformation came over Patrick Henry. He rises to his full height. His voice booms out to the gathered thousands. His eloquence seemed like an avalanche threatening to overwhelm his adversary. Henry says, Virginia has planted thorns upon my pillow. Henry has a way with words. Henry says that Virginia is to the Union as Charlotte County is to Virginia. Virginia has no more right to ignore the laws of the Union than Charlotte County has to ignore the laws of Virginia. Such opposition on the part of Virginia to the acts of the general government must beget their enforcement by military power, civil war, foreign alliances. He warns the people, Virginia will face an army led by George Washington. Who will dare to lift his hand against the father of his country, to point a weapon at the breast of a man who often led them to battle and to victory? Well, it's an 18th century election. People had been drinking. So when Henry says this, there's a fellow in the audience who's drunk, John Harvey. We actually know his name. Henry, who will dare to lift his hand? John Harvey, I would. This was a mistake. Henry rises up and turns on him. You dare not do it. In such a parricidal attempt, the steel will drop from your nerveless arm. This is classic Henry. Henry turns on the Alien and Sedition Act, and he says, if you don't like the Alien and Sedition Acts, the people hold the reins over Congress. They elect Congress. The government is your government. Congress were as much our representatives as the Virginia Assembly and had as good a right to our confidence. If the administration has done wrong, let us all go wrong together. United we stand, divided we fall. let us not split into factions, which must destroy the union upon which our existence hangs. Is the federal government too powerful? Have they violated your rights? It is necessary to submit to the constitutional exercise of that power. How do you oppose government policy? Henry tells the people, you go to the ballot box. You go to the ballot box. You oppose government policy in a constitutional way. People ask Henry, don't we have the right of revolution? You were the great revolutionary. And Henry says, yes, the people always have the right of revolution, but only when their complaints cannot be otherwise redressed through the democratic process. He warns them that if you can't live with the Constitution that you adopted, we will have civil commotions and intestine wars. You may bid adieu forever to representative government. You can never exchange the present government, but for a monarchy. Henry reminds the people that he had opposed the Constitution, but he says, we agreed. I didn't agree, I voted against it. We, the people, agreed. And if we can't live with this Constitution, the only option is monarchy. Henry understands that the first rule in a democracy, we are all familiar with, the majority rules. The second rule is equally important. The minority must accept the first rule, at least until the next election. Well, as I said, Patrick Henry wins his election, but he dies before he can take office. He dies on June 6th. John Randolph of Roanoke, one of the great Jeffersonians from the early 19th century, he says in the 18 teens that had Henry lived, Jefferson certainly would not have been elected president. But that then leads to the second question. What of Jefferson? What's going on here with Jefferson? Is there something we need to know about Jefferson and James Madison? Because the conventional wisdom, the standard history, is you get the Alien and Sedition Acts, followed by the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, and lo and behold, Thomas Jefferson is elected president in 1800. Historians have accepted that conventional wisdom. Akio Omar at Yale talks about the first opportunity for the people to weigh in on the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions was the 1800 election, and we elected Jefferson. This is in fact very misleading, because they had midterm elections too. And there was a midterm election between the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions and the presidential election of 1800. And in that midterm election, the Democratic Republicans, the Jeffersonians, took a shellacking. In the Deep South, the North Carolina, Georgia, and South Carolina, the number of Federalist members of Congress went from 4 to 12. In Virginia, the number of Federalist members of Congress went from 4 to 8. And much worse from Jefferson's perspective, they elected Henry, Light Horse Harry Lee, with the assistance of Patrick Henry, a great opponent of Jefferson, and even worse, John Marshall is elected to the Congress with the assistance of Patrick Henry, and John Marshall goes on to become the Secretary of State and very quickly the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. I've often wondered whether Jefferson thinks years later whether it's Patrick Henry's fault. I got that son of a gun at the Supreme Court. So the Jeffersonians, as I said, take a shellacking. Jefferson, talking about that election, says it astonished everyone. But Joseph Cabell, if we have any UVA grads in the audience, they'll recognize that name. Joseph Cabell, the man who helps Jefferson build UVA. Cabell says, no, it was fear of disunion that caused the Democratic Republicans to lose that election. Kentucky and Virginia had asked the other states to support them, and in fact, 10 of the 16 other states specifically reject the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. No other state supports them. And Jefferson and Madison do something that we want our politicians to do. They realized they had made a mistake, and they backpedaled backpedaled, and they backpedaled hard and fast. Now, they don't admit it publicly. They're politicians. They won't do that. But they backpedaled, and they changed, and they stopped talking immediately about nullification. They stopped talking about states' rights, and they started talking about freedom of the press and a government that was too powerful in interfering with people's rights. And the evidence for this is actually fascinating that, again, I think historians have missed. I came across another letter. 8 days after the Virginia resolutions are adopted. Okay, let's pause for a moment. Jefferson writes the Kentucky resolutions. James Madison writes the Virginia resolutions. The Virginia resolutions are much weaker than the Kentucky resolutions. No talk about nullification, no talk about null and void, but they do say that the country is a compact of independent sovereign states. So 8 days after those resolutions, those weaker resolutions are adopted that James Madison had written, Madison writes Jefferson saying, I think we went too far. It is to be feared their zeal, he's referring to the Virginia General Assembly for adopting his resolutions word for word. Their zeal may forget some consideration which ought to temper their proceedings. We will be accused of usurpation in the very act of protesting against the usurpations of Congress. And then another interesting incident that shows how much they had backed off. In 1798 and 1799, the Jeffersonians had been almost begging the federal government to prosecute someone for sedition in the South, because all of those prosecutions I had been talking about had occurred north of the Mason-Dixon line. And they were openly begging. They said, try to do this in the South. In Virginia, a law was introduced into the General Assembly that would have given state judges the right to issue habeas corpus against federal prisoners. Now think about that for a moment. A federal judge has a federal grand jury, indict someone, and has an armed federal marshal take them to jail, and a state judge sends an armed sheriff to get them out of jail. That's what they were talking about. And they said, go ahead, try it in the South. Well, in 1800, in fact, they do prosecute someone. The author of this, The Prospect Before Us, James Callender. Some of you may be familiar with that name. A few years later, he's the one who's going to come out with the story about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. That's a different story. He's thrown in jail in Virginia for sedition, for attacking John Adams. James Monroe, the new governor of Virginia, writes to Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and says, don't do anything stupid. I'm paraphrasing. But he warns them. He says, look, this is a matter of free press. He says we need to act by a perfect obedience to this law. Let freedom of the press become a burden to themselves, to the Federalists. No talk about states' rights, no talk about nullification. And that idea is tabled until it explodes over Fort Sumter 60 years later. But then what about Thomas Jefferson? What about President Jefferson? Since Thomas Jefferson was inaugurated, for the last 200 years, historians have attacked him and politicians have said Thomas Jefferson is a hypocrite because as president, he would not do the things that he was talking about in the 1790s. Well, you know, there may be another explanation than hypocrisy. Maybe he understood they had gone too far. Maybe he understood that the hyper-partisanship of the 1790s that he had participated in almost destroyed the country. And if you reread Thomas Jefferson's first inaugural address in that light, you see an amazing document. Jefferson, after one of the most heated political campaigns in U.S. history, in which people had fought each other in the streets, he said, we need to unite in common efforts for the common good. He tells the people that the will of the majority is in all cases to prevail, that first rule of democracy. But he goes on and says, that will, to be rightful, must be reasonable, that the minority, he's now talking about Alexander Hamilton and those hated Federalists, the minority possess their equal rights, which equal laws must protect, and to violate them would be oppression. Let us then, fellow citizens, unite with one heart and one mind. He turns on the partisanship of the 1790s and he tells the people that political intolerance is as despotic, as wicked, as capable of a bitter and bloody persecution as religious intolerance. Every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. Thomas Jefferson is reminding us that what unites us is more important than what divides us. Ironically, Thomas Jefferson's victory ends the crisis. Had he lost, had John Adams won, we don't know what would have happened. Would Jefferson and Madison have precipitated a civil war in 1800? But that then leads to this third question. Why is this story not a bigger part of history? You know, Patrick Henry, almost everyone has heard of Patrick Henry. But if you ask Americans about Patrick Henry, if they remember anything, they remember 7 words he spoke at St. John's Courthouse in March of 1775, give me liberty or give me death. And they don't necessarily know a lot else about Patrick Henry. And this is unusual. This is not sensible. He was much more important than that. In 1776 and 1786, he would have been on everyone's short list of leading patriots and leaders of the Revolution. Why does George Washington write Patrick Henry and no one else and ask him to help save the Union in 1799? Why do we not know more about Patrick Henry? Well, I think there's 3 reasons. I think, first of all, we don't have a lot of records from Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry doesn't really just seem to care a lot about what you and I think about him. Now, that's sort of funny, except that George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, John Adams, they cared a lot about what you and I were going to think about them. And they curated their papers and they curated their letters and they made sure that someone was going to organize them and was going to have these good histories of what they did. Patrick Henry burned some of his letters. He doesn't maintain others. He doesn't seem to care. I think a second reason is after he opposed ratification of the Constitution, and after all, who opposes ratification of the Constitution? Today we think of it as a sacred document. But he had passed up Secretary of State. He had passed up Supreme Court Justice. He had passed up Senator, Ambassador. If he had taken those positions, perhaps he would be better known. But there's a third reason. Patrick Henry is directly and viciously attacked by his political opponents for years before his death and for years after his death. It is said of Patrick Henry, he is all tongue without either head or heart. What we have to do is devoutly pray for his death. He is avaricious and rotten-hearted. He read nothing. He had no books. He wrote almost nothing. He could not write. In his heart, he preferred low society. His legal reasoning is not worth a copper. Henry wanted personal courage. He's a coward. His 2 great passions were the love of money and of fame. George Wythe, the great jurist of 18th century Virginia, absolutely refused to sign his law license. And worst of all, he had contempt and hatred for George Washington. All of these things are said by Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson doesn't like Patrick Henry. Now, and this has an effect. It has an effect over time. And Jefferson continues this for years after Henry's dead. In 1824, Henry's been in the grave for 24, 25 years. A young Daniel Webster comes to visit Thomas Jefferson. He's an up-and-coming politician, and Jefferson's saying many of these things about Patrick Henry, who's been long dead. And it continues to other Jeffersonians. So, for example, the Aurora, which is the great Jeffersonian newspaper of that era, the Aurora in early 1799, had written an article about Patrick Henry, which said that he was venerable. His reputation is like pure and his talents conspicuous. After that March 1799 speech, the Aurora has a new article about Patrick Henry. It says he is under the insuspicious temper of second childhood. It has made him a dupe. He drag his aged limbs and break his wind. He farts. They're telling fart jokes about Patrick Henry. Now, why is this? It actually relates to Jefferson's governorship. Patrick Henry is the first governor of the independent state of Virginia for 3 years. Thomas Jefferson is the second governor. Jefferson, unfortunately, is governor when the Redcoats invade Virginia, and he's not able to stop the Redcoats, which is really not his fault. But when the Redcoats chase the Virginia General Assembly out of Richmond to Charlottesville, and then out of Charlottesville to Stanton, Thomas Jefferson's term had technically expired, his second term as governor. He was eligible for a third term, but he wrote to the head of the General Assembly and he said, don't appoint me. Don't appoint me for a third term as governor. You need someone with military experience. There's redcoats all over the state. And they did appoint Thomas Nelson Jr., who, by the way, leads the Virginia military in the field at the Battle of Yorktown. Highly unusual for a sitting governor to do that. But Jefferson, when the Virginia General Assembly flees from Charlottesville to Stanton across the Blue Ridge Mountains, Jefferson goes with his family to his home in Lynchburg, Poplar Forest. It appears that he's abandoned the state. And the first thing the Virginia General Assembly does when they reconvene in Stanton, Virginia, is appoint Thomas Nelson Jr. as the new governor. The second thing they do is they launch an investigation of Thomas Jefferson, essentially accusing him of cowardice, of dishonor, and of incompetence. This so upsets Jefferson, he writes James Monroe that it has imposed a wound on my spirit which will only be cured by the all-healing grave. I mean, even for Jefferson. It's worth remembering this, though, because the personal battles of these founders sometimes had effects. They're not marble statues. They were real people and had real fights. Well, I've been talking for a long time. You know, when you go to graduate school in history, the classic question is, so what? You know, it's a great story. So what? Why do we care about this today? Do we care about this today? I think there are actually 4 important so whats here. First, Thomas Jefferson is absolutely correct about the first crisis, the centrality of free press and freedom of speech. We cannot run this nation without a free press. Anyone who tells you the free press is the enemy of the American people fundamentally misunderstands the American experience. Second, so what? States' rights can go too far. Thomas Jefferson talks about nullification. Governor Abbott has become fond of quoting Thomas Jefferson's nullification without understanding or not caring about this history and the fact that that position was rejected because it was going to create a civil war, and that Patrick Henry, the intellectual godfather of the states' rights movement, who understood states' rights better than anyone, said this can go too far. That's an important so what. Third so what, Henry is right about what do we do when we oppose government policy. You go to the ballot box. You go to the ballot box. If we turn to political violence, the only option is the end of the country and monarchy. And final, so what? It's important to remember that history is not simply lived, but it is written. And in this case, this history tended to be forgotten because it's a classic case of the winners write the history. But it's an important history, and I think people want to know something about it, and I hope you found it interesting. And with that, I would be very interested in your questions. Wait for the microphone.
John, I'd like to go to the election of 1800. It's my understanding it was a tie between Jefferson, Adams, and Burr. You don't talk much about that other than to say, jump forward, now Jefferson's the president.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit about what happened in terms of how he broke the tie and how Jefferson prevailed? Was there some fear that what you talked about tonight may happen if he didn't win the tie?
Right. So you've got the story, there's a slight twist. It's a tie between Jefferson and Aaron Burr. They actually have a few more electoral votes than Adams. So under the Constitution, Adams is out, and the House of Representatives has to break the tie between Jefferson and Aaron Burr. Now, this was a screw-up because Burr, everybody understood that Burr was supposed to be the vice president, Jefferson was supposed to be the president. And the way they tried to work the Electoral College is somebody was supposed to make sure that one of the electors would drop a vote for the vice president, would vote for someone else, so that the vice presidential candidate would always end up with one less electoral vote than the presidential candidate. And apparently somebody rather stupidly asked Aaron Burr to make sure that somebody dropped the vote for Aaron Burr. So that didn't happen. And they ended up in a tie. And it was, and I talk about this a little bit in the book. I don't focus on it. That was another crisis. So again, this election of 1800, it was bad. John McKean, it's not Thomas McKean, who's the governor of Pennsylvania, is talking about getting the Pennsylvania militia to march on Philadelphia if they don't put Jefferson into the presidency. Jefferson later says there was no talk about violence, horse hockey. I mean, we've got the letters. So how do they break it? You know, I think historians get this wrong. I have the advantage or disadvantage of, I was a lobbyist in Washington for 20 years. I was a registered lobbyist. I have a little bit of sense of how things actually happen in Congress. And the Delaware representative, because there was only one representative from Delaware, basically changes his vote and gets a few other people to change his vote. And what happens is the Jeffersonians say, well, we promised him nothing. And the Federalists say, no, no, no. He promised us that he wasn't going to fire every Federalist bureaucrat and that he wasn't going to dissolve the Navy. Those were two things that were critical. And that he would pay our debts. The federal debt would not be abandoned. Those were critically important. And historians take one side or the other. Either Jefferson, they said nothing. That's not what happened. They had somebody meet with somebody who was a Republican, and they said, well, of course, I can't make any commitments, but the president has no intention of firing all the federal bureaucrats. It gets reported to the Federalists. The president has no intention of firing all the federal, and everything just happens. But it was a very hotly contested dispute.
Well, while somebody's thinking about a question, I got a question, and I may be mixed up, but I know the election of 1800, newspapers were kind of like our TV. They took a position. What happened to the Alien and Sedition Act? Callender was writing these awful things, What happened?
Oh, it's a good question. First of all, you have to distinguish the Alien and Sedition Act. The Sedition Act, the Federalists were not stupid. So it actually had an expiration date of March 3rd, 1801. The new president would be inaugurated on March 4th. Now, if Adams had won, they could simply re-up the law, but they had set it up so that the new president would not necessarily have that authority. Now, of course, the Jeffersonians could have reintroduced the law, but Jefferson had taken the position that this is a violation of freedom of the press and of the First Amendment. The Alien Acts, some of them disappear. There's actually 4 Alien Acts. The Alien Enemies Act is still on the books, and that is what our current president is citing in a rather convoluted. That was not why the law was drafted. It was drafted anticipating an actual war with France, and about 10% of the Philadelphia about 10% of the Philadelphia population at that time were French nationals who had come here after the French Revolution or after the Haitian Revolution. So it was about a real war. And so that law is still on the books. Now, the other thing you mentioned is the media, but it's actually important to understand there is a difference. I mentioned the Aurora. At that time, newspapers were on one side or the other. Everybody understood that this newspaper was a Democratic Republican newspaper, that newspaper is a Federalist newspaper. And sometimes people will say, well, that's just like today. No, it's not like today. OAN, Fox News, Sinclair, on the other side, HuffPost. These are news organizations that are set up with a particular perspective. It's in their DNA. They're going to take this side or that side. You may like or dislike ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times. They're not like that. They can change depending on what their editor thinks at any individual time. Now, I'm not necessarily enamored with everything I see out of our current media, but it is very different from the situation you have with, say, Fox News and HuffPost, where they're coming at you specifically from one direction.
Question, any more questions? Yeah, Rod.
Surprise. Could you talk a little bit about your opinion, given the history that you know and what's going on today? What's the future of democracy in America?
Oh, boy. I don't have a great answer to that. I have a couple of thoughts. And I mentioned this to Richard on the way over here. People say this country's divided, and in some ways it is. But I think that the media reports that it's divided because that's good news. That sells the newspapers, that gets people to pay attention. When I gave tours at Monticello, I would talk about Thomas Jefferson's tombstone. Thomas Jefferson's tombstone, he writes the epitaph, and it says, "Here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of American Independence, of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia." Political freedom, religious freedom, and public education. You're not going to find many Americans who disagree with the fact that we need to have political freedom, religious freedom, and public education, good public education. We're going to argue about how you do it, because that's what you do in a democracy. And we could have that debate. But I don't think Americans disagree with that idea. I don't think, we had millions of people taking the streets saying, we don't want a king. We could argue about what makes a king, and we could have a difference of opinion on that. But Americans don't disagree. We don't want a king. Now, what has caused the current situation and what's going to happen? I think gerrymandering is a huge problem, and your assembly is currently trying to make that worse. I think the media is an issue that could do better. I think there are things that could be done in electoral politics. I think one thing, this kind of group, look, we have seen major declines. My first two books are about religious freedom, about the development of religious freedom. And so I spend a lot of time studying religious history and religious freedom. We've seen major declines in religious participation in this country over the last 20, 30, 40 years. At the same time, we've seen major declines in public participation in the Kiwanis, Rotary, the Women's Club. Those community organizations, that getting together with your neighbors and talking about things that are important are so essential. And so I think that people are starting to be aware of that. I recently spoke at the commencement address at Hampton Sydney College. And I said to the young men, it's a men's college, they're all young men. And I said, join the JCs, join the Rotary, join the Lions Club. It's what we need in this country. So I'm not going to tell you to join your church. That's a minister can do that for you. But so I try to be an optimist.
John, thank you for coming. I greatly appreciate it. My question is about gerrymandering. There's some there's a historian piece that I saw that says Patrick Henry gerrymandered the congressional race for Madison. And can you speak a little bit of why Henry was opposed to the Constitution and his role in getting the Bill of Rights added to the U.S. Constitution?
Okay, Nate, that's very good. Those are very good questions. Henry's concern is that the government's going to be too powerful. It's going to interfere with the rights, and we need a Bill of Rights. I mean, that people say that James Madison is the father of the Bill of Rights. It might be more accurate to say Patrick Henry is the father of the Bill of Rights, the anti-federalist, by demanding that there be a Bill of Rights. Now, James Madison's the one who actually drafts the Bill of Rights. And Madison figures out, and Madison's a smart guy, he figures out, look, I didn't agree with Henry that we needed all of these amendments, but you know, he may be onto something with this implied powers business. Henry kept talking about the necessary and proper clause in the Constitution, which gives the government implied powers, expansive powers. And Madison, during the debates, had said, no, that's not going to happen. He starts thinking about it, and he says, you know, maybe that is going to happen. So he drafts the Bill of Rights, but he has only rights about individual rights and protection of free speech, rights of trial, due process. He leaves out some of the amendments that Henry wanted, which would have restricted federal power and left it in the states. And in fact, when Henry first reads the 10th Amendment, which is currently being quoted as somehow creating great deal of authority in the states, Henry reads the 10th Amendment and says, we were duped. This amendment doesn't do anything, which the Supreme Court has generally agreed. It doesn't do anything. So Henry is critically important. The Anti-Federalists are critically important in getting the Bill of Rights. But Madison drafts those protections for individual rights. So, yeah, please. See if he would read it. On gerrymandering, Henry does arguably gerrymander against James Madison. Madison realizes that they hadn't been specific enough in the Constitution. So, for example, the other thing nobody has asked about, why would Jefferson have lost the election? It actually relates to manipulation of the Electoral College, because they're just figuring out that it's not really explained very well in the Constitution, and they're figuring out winner take all. And when that happens, Madison says, this is not what we intended. And Madison proposes an amendment that would have required electing electors by district, which we only now have 2 states, that Maine and Nebraska, and would have made it far less likely that someone could win the popular vote and lose the Electoral College. And so they just didn't think about gerrymandering, and they didn't think about winner take all.
We have one more, the last question back here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for such an insightful talk. In our early history and over time, there's been debate on the party system and its effect in the functioning of our democracy. And I'm curious about your insight from your historical perspective on our party system and how it affects our democracy.
It's 8 o'clock. No. This is another thing that they had not anticipated, and a lot of historians talk about this, that they didn't realize we were going to end up in a party system, and certainly not a 2-party system. Madison talks about this. George Washington, in his farewell address, which is a wonderful document. Students should be required to reread George Washington's farewell address every year. And he talks about the danger of faction, the danger of party, the danger of putting party over country, which is exactly what he was writing to Henry about. That's what he thought Jefferson and Madison were doing here. Well, how did we end up in this situation? And why is it different from almost every other democracy in the world? The presidency is different from a prime minister. And if you sort of, from a political science, if they had consulted with political scientists for a month or so, because of the way the presidency is set up, you get a winner. You're going to end up almost inevitably with 2 parties, because because you don't want to have a lot of guys, because that's going to break the vote up. So you're either going to be with this guy or this guy. and you end up with a two-party system, which you don't really have, even in Canada. I mean, Canada has 3 large parties and 4 or 5 small parties. And because of that party system, you can end up with a prime minister creating a coalition, and it makes it much harder. You don't get this hard, you're either blue or you're red, that we have under our system. And some people have suggested we should have a new constitutional convention and adopt a Canadian, a European, a British system where you have a prime minister rather than a president, or you have a president. France has a president, but the president's is largely for ceremonial purposes and some foreign policy implications. So, you know, this is things that the founding fathers were brilliant, and they thought of a lot of things. There were things they didn't think of or that they got wrong. They did not think about gerrymandering. They did not think about winner take all in electoral college. And they didn't realize that because of the way the presidency was designed, it would eventually, and it only took about 8 years, it would end up into a two-party, and there have been minor parties, but nobody ever makes any progress because there's going to be one winner in that presidential election. They expected a lot more constitutional amendments. They expected the Constitution to be amended regularly. And so, for example, Thomas Jefferson refers to, he objects to sanctimonious reverence given that written document. This is Thomas Jefferson. This is the guy who's supposedly the originalist that the Supreme Court loves to quote and say, you know, what he said about the Constitution? He says sanctimonious reverence. He says you might as well ask an adult male to wear the coat that he wore as a child as to expect our society to abide by the laws that were adopted 50 years ago. So we need to become at least cognizant of the fact that sometimes change is necessary. And we have to start working together on some of those changes. And as I said, I do think, I mean, we talk about other things. I think gerrymandering is a huge problem because it creates a situation, you know, you look at the media, there's 435 members of Congress, 15 contested elections. And everybody else knows that you're either a Democrat or you're a Republican, and we're not going to talk to you otherwise. That's wrong. And that is not the way to run a sound country. So it's, you know, what Jefferson also would say, is it's up to us. It's our job to fix it.
Great way to end. Thank John Ragosta for coming halfway across this continent to speak to us today. Interrobang has books upstairs. He'll be signing them as long as they last. Next week is our last Rejebian. Janice Bird is going to do Brian Kilmeade's book. She's going to review it. Teddy and Booker T. So see you next week.